Are you aware that 13 U.S. states are heading into 2026 with such severe structural vulnerabilities that when the recession hits, they won't just experience downturns, they'll face potential systemic collapse? Let me ask you something. Do you know which states have combined unsustainable debt loads exceeding $500 billion, pension funding ratios below 50%, and employment bases so concentrated in recession-vulnerable sectors that a single quarter of contraction could trigger cascading failures across housing markets, municipal services, and tax revenues simultaneously? What we're about to walk through isn't speculation about difficult times ahead. This is a forensic analysis of 13 states where the mathematical realities of debt service obligations, demographic collapse, and fiscal mismanagement have created conditions where normal recession responses simply won't work. Before we go any further, if staying informed about which states face the greatest economic danger as we move into 2026 matters to you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell, because the data I'm examining reveals vulnerabilities that mainstream coverage consistently downplays. Let me show you the framework we're examining. When recession conditions materialize in 2026, three specific triggers will determine which states experience manageable downturns versus which ones face potential collapse. Trigger number one is fiscal capacity, the actual mathematical ability of state governments to absorb revenue declines while maintaining essential services. Recent analysis shows that 8 states currently operate with debt-to-GDP ratios exceeding 25%, combined with unfunded pension liabilities that require annual contributions consuming more than 15% of general fund revenues. When recession cuts tax revenues by the typical 8 to 12%, these states face immediate choices between defaulting on pension obligations, slashing services, or emergency borrowing at crisis interest rates. Trigger number 2 is employment concentration in recession-vulnerable sectors. 5 states have more than 35% of their employment base in either government positions funded by stressed state budgets, tourism and hospitality sectors that collapse first during contractions, or real estate-related industries already showing distress signals. CoreLogic data from late 2025 shows that these concentrated employment bases create multiplier effects where initial job losses trigger housing market failures, which reduce property tax revenues, forcing municipal layoffs that accelerate the employment crisis. Trigger number 3 is population and tax-based trajectory. Census data through 2025 reveals that 7 states have experienced net domestic outmigration for 3 consecutive years, with high-income residents departing at rates 40 to 60% above average, while simultaneously seeing increases in benefit-dependent populations. This creates a fiscal death spiral, where the tax base shrinks exactly as demand for state services increases, leaving governments mathematically unable to balance budgets without either massive cuts or equally massive tax increases that accelerate further departure of productive residents. Now that you understand the 3-trigger framework, let me walk you through the 13 states facing the greatest collapse risk, starting with the 5 where the combination of all 3 factors creates immediate danger. Number 1 is Illinois, and here's what makes this state's position so severe that recovery may be structurally impossible. Illinois enters 2026 trapped with $144 billion in unfunded pension obligations, the largest absolute pension crisis in the nation. The state's pension funding ratio sits at just 46%, meaning for every dollar of promised benefits, the state has 54 cents of unfunded liability. What makes this mathematically catastrophic is that Illinois already dedicates approximately 25% of its general fund revenue, roughly $10 billion annually, just to pension contributions, and that's with the pensions remaining 54% underfunded. Moody's current debt ratio analysis places Illinois at 468.7%, the highest state debt burden in America, when combining general obligation bonds, pension liabilities, and other post-employment benefits. When recession conditions reduce Illinois tax revenues by even a modest 10%, that's approximately $4.8 billion in lost annual revenue based on the state's $48 billion general fund. The state cannot cut pension contributions because they're already underfunded by $144 billion. It cannot significantly raise taxes because Illinois already has the second highest combined state and local tax burden in the nation, and recent data shows the state lost 122,460 residents to domestic outmigration between 2020 and 2023, with particular concentration among households earning above $200,000 annually. The Case-Shiller Index for Chicago shows home price growth of just 1.5% year-over-year as of late 2025, the weakest among major Midwest metros, signaling that the tax base supporting property tax revenues is already stagnant. Cook County property tax rates average approximately $11,000 annually on median value homes, compared to a national average of roughly $2,500, a 340% increase that's already driving departure. Here's the compounding factor most analyses miss. Illinois has 35% of its workforce employed in government, education, healthcare, and social services, sectors either directly funded by stressed state budgets or heavily dependent on government reimbursement rates. When recession forces Illinois to cut spending, these job losses hit immediately, triggering mortgage defaults, retail failures, and further tax revenue collapse. Atom Data Solutions foreclosure data from October 2025 shows Illinois already experiencing one foreclosure filing for every 1,171 housing units, well above the national average, and this is before recession conditions materialize. The state's position isn't just difficult, it's mathematically trapped with no path to solvency that doesn't involve either federal bailout or actual default on obligations. Number 2 is New Jersey. And what you need to understand is that New Jersey combines Illinois-level pension underfunding with the highest property tax burden in America, and an employment base heavily concentrated in finance and real estate sectors already showing severe stress. New Jersey's unfunded pension liability exceeds $90 billion, with a funding ratio of approximately 58%, meaning the state faces a $90 billion hole, requiring ever-increasing contributions from a shrinking tax base. The state's total debt burden, including bonds, pensions, and other obligations, represents approximately 42% of state GDP, among the highest ratios nationally. Here's what makes this immediately dangerous heading into 2026. New Jersey property owners already pay average property taxes of $9,490 annually, the highest in the nation, with counties like Essex, Bergen, and Union seeing median property taxes exceeding $12,000. Redfin data from late 2025 shows that 31% of New Jersey home listings are experiencing price reductions, compared to a national average of 19%, signaling that sellers are already struggling to find buyers willing to absorb these tax burdens. The state lost 70,350 residents to domestic outmigration between 2020 and 2023, and IRS migration data shows these departing residents had average incomes 27% higher than arriving residents, meaning New Jersey is experiencing high-income tax base erosion while retaining or gaining lower-income residents requiring more state services. The state's employment concentration in financial services, which represents approximately 8.4% of total employment compared to 4.3% nationally, creates massive recession vulnerability because finance sector layoffs hit immediately when markets contract. When you combine $90 billion in unfunded pensions, the nation's highest property tax burden already driving out migration, and concentrated employment in recession-vulnerable sectors, New Jersey faces conditions where recession doesn't just create hardship, it triggers cascading failures across housing values, tax revenues, and municipal bond markets simultaneously. Counties like Passaic, which saw a 156% increase in foreclosure filings in late 2025 according to Atom data, show that stress is already building before recession arrives. Number 3 is Connecticut. And here's why this small state faces collapse risk despite its reputation for wealth. Connecticut combines the fourth highest state debt burden in America, with pension underfunding exceeding $40 billion and demographic trends showing sustained population loss concentrated among prime working-age residents. The state's bonded debt per capita exceeds $7,900, more than double the national average, while unfunded pension liabilities add another $12,000 per resident to the actual obligation burden. Moody's analysis places Connecticut's debt ratio at approximately 266% when including all obligations, among the 10 highest state burdens nationally. What makes Connecticut's position structurally dangerous is that the state has become heavily dependent on a very narrow tax base. Approximately 1% of Connecticut taxpayers, roughly 15,000 households earning above $2 million annually, contribute nearly 25% of the state's income tax revenue. This extreme concentration means that when recession hits and capital gains income collapses, as it typically falls 30 to 40% during contractions, Connecticut faces immediate revenue crises that cannot be solved by taxing the broader population, because that population is already heavily taxed and departing. Census data shows Connecticut lost population in 8 of the last 10 years, with net domestic outmigration totaling approximately 53,000 residents between 2020 and 2023. The state's prime working age population, residents aged 25 to 54, declined by 4.7% between 2010 and 2020, among the steepest declines nationally. This demographic trajectory means Connecticut enters recession with a shrinking workforce supporting growing retiree obligations. The state's employment base includes approximately 17% government workers and another 15% in financial services and insurance, both highly recession-vulnerable sectors. When you layer recession-driven revenue collapse onto a $40 billion pension hole, $20 billion in bonded debt, and sustained outmigration of high-income taxpayers, Connecticut faces a position where maintaining current service levels becomes mathematically impossible without emergency federal intervention. Number 4 is California, and I need you to understand something critical about America's largest state economy. California's sheer size, with GDP exceeding $3.9 trillion, masks structural vulnerabilities that become catastrophic precisely because of that scale. The state carries unfunded pension liabilities exceeding $300 billion when using realistic return assumptions rather than the optimistic projections officially reported. CalPERS, the nation's largest public pension fund, assumes 6.8% annual returns, but achieving returns below that assumption, which becomes likely during recession, increases the unfunded liability by billions annually. California's official state debt exceeds $145 billion, but when including obligations of state authorities, lease obligations, and pension liabilities, the actual burden approaches $1 trillion. Here's what makes this position immediately dangerous heading into 2026. California has become the nation's most expensive housing market, with median home prices exceeding $830,000 statewide as of late 2025, more than double the national median. Zillow data shows that housing inventory in California metros has surged 40% year over year through late 2025, while pending sales have dropped 12%, signaling that demand is collapsing under the weight of prices and mortgage rates. The state has experienced net domestic outmigration exceeding 500,000 residents between 2020 and 2023, the largest absolute exodus of any state. IRS migration data reveals that departing California residents had average adjusted gross incomes of $137,000, while arriving residents averaged $97,000, meaning California is losing approximately $40,000 in average income per net departing household. This represents billions in annual tax base erosion. California depends heavily on capital gains taxes, which represent approximately 15% of general fund revenue in strong economic years, but collapse by 40 to 50% during recessions as asset sales and valuations decline. The state's progressive income tax structure means the top 1% of earners contribute approximately 50% of income tax revenue, creating massive volatility when high earners see income drops during contraction. California's employment base includes approximately 2.8 million government workers at state and local levels, 16% of total employment, all dependent on tax revenues that will fall sharply during recession. When you combine $300 billion in pension underfunding, sustained outmigration of high-income tax base, collapsed housing demand showing in surging inventory, and extreme dependence on volatile capital gains taxes. California faces a recession scenario where revenue collapse forces either massive service cuts affecting 39 million residents or emergency borrowing that further deteriorates the state's credit position. Number 5 is Hawaii, and here's why this state faces unique collapse vulnerability despite its small size. Hawaii has the most concentrated economy in America, with tourism and tourism-related industries representing approximately 25% of total economic activity and 21% of state tax revenues directly dependent on visitor spending. Recent data from the Hawaii Tourism Authority shows that visitor arrivals in late 2025 were running just 2% above 2019 levels, while visitor spending adjusted for inflation remains 8% below 2019, signaling that the tourism recovery has stalled before recession even arrives. When recession hits, tourism spending typically falls 15 to 25% as discretionary travel budgets get cut first, meaning Hawaii faces immediate revenue collapse affecting its largest economic sector. The state's unfunded pension liability exceeds $15 billion, which sounds modest in absolute terms but represents approximately 15% of state GDP, among the highest ratios nationally. Hawaii's bonded debt per capita exceeds $6,200, well above national averages, while the state's isolated geographic position means it has no adjacent economic regions to provide employment or revenue stability. Here's what compounds Hawaii's vulnerability. The state has the highest cost of living in America, with median home prices exceeding $850,000, and grocery costs running 50% above mainland averages due to shipping dependencies. This high-cost structure means that when tourism jobs are lost during recession, displaced workers cannot easily shift to other industries because alternative employment pays less while costs remain extreme. Census data shows Hawaii has experienced net domestic outmigration for 8 consecutive years, losing approximately 38,000 residents to other states between 2020 and 2023. The only reason Hawaii's total population hasn't collapsed is international migration, primarily from Asia, but recession typically reduces international migration flows, removing this population buffer. Hawaii's government employment represents approximately 18% of total state employment, well above the national average of 14%, and these positions depend entirely on tax revenues that will fall sharply when visitor spending collapses. The state's housing market shows early distress signals, with Oahu inventory up 47% year-over-year in late 2025 according to local MLS data, while pending sales have dropped 15%, indicating that even before recession, demand is weakening. When you combine extreme economic concentration in recession-vulnerable tourism, $15 billion in unfunded pensions, the nation's highest cost structure, sustained outmigration, and massive dependence on government employment, Hawaii faces conditions where recession creates not just hardship, but potential economic collapse requiring federal emergency assistance. Moving to number 6 is Pennsylvania, where the combination of pension underfunding exceeding $70 billion and concentrated economic dependence on healthcare and education sectors funded by stressed government budgets creates severe recession vulnerability. The state's pension funding ratio sits at approximately 59%, meaning nearly half of promised retirement benefits remain unfunded despite annual contributions consuming roughly $5 billion from the state budget. When recession reduces Pennsylvania tax revenues by a typical 8 to 10%, that's approximately $3.6 billion in lost annual revenue based on the state's general fund, creating immediate pressure on a budget already strained by pension obligations. Philadelphia County alone has seen foreclosure filings jump 22% year-over-year through late 2025, according to ATTOM data, signaling housing stress even before recession arrives. Number 7 is Louisiana, facing collapse risk from the combination of extreme dependence on volatile oil and gas revenues, which represent approximately 13% of state general revenue, infrastructure damage from climate events requiring billions in unbudgeted spending, and pension underfunding exceeding $18 billion. When recession combines with potential energy sector weakness, Louisiana faces revenue collapse from multiple directions simultaneously. The state has lost population for 5 consecutive years, with net domestic outmigration totaling approximately 107,000 residents between 2018 and 2023, shrinking the tax base exactly as infrastructure and pension obligations grow. Number 8 is Kentucky, where unfunded pension liabilities exceeding $40 billion combine with one of the nation's lowest median household incomes, at approximately $56,000, to create a position where the tax base cannot support the obligation burden. The state's pension funding ratio of roughly 45% is among the lowest nationally, while government employment represents approximately 19% of total state employment, meaning recession-forced budget cuts create immediate job losses affecting nearly 1 in 5 workers. Foreclosure rates in Kentucky metros, including Louisville, rose 18% year over year through late 2025. Number 9 is New York, and while the state's massive economy provides some buffer, the combination of unfunded pension liabilities exceeding $60 billion, New York City's structural budget deficit approaching $7 billion, and sustained outmigration of high-income residents create severe recession vulnerability. IRS data shows New York lost approximately 450,000 residents to domestic outmigration between 2020 and 2023, with departing households having average incomes roughly $27,000 higher than arriving households. The state depends heavily on finance sector employment and capital gains taxes, both highly volatile during recession. Number 10 is New Mexico, facing vulnerability from extreme dependence on oil and gas revenues, exceeding 30% of state general revenue, poverty rates among the highest nationally at 18.2%, and limited economic diversity that leaves few alternative revenue sources when energy markets contract. The state's small population of just 2.1 million means that modest absolute dollar revenue declines create large percentage budget impacts requiring immediate cuts to services affecting low-income populations. Number 11 is Oregon, where the combination of pension underfunding in the PERS system exceeding $25 billion, extreme housing unaffordability with Portland metro median prices above $570,000, and economic concentration in timber and technology sectors, both vulnerable to recession, creates compounding risks. The state has seen significant outmigration from Portland metro in particular, with census data showing the city lost population in 2021, 2022, and 2023, eroding the urban tax base that funds much of state revenue. Number 12 is Rhode Island, America's smallest state by area, facing outsized collapse risk from pension underfunding exceeding $8 billion, which represents approximately 12% of state GDP, combined with population decline, aging demographics, and limited economic diversity. The state's bonded debt per capita exceeds $5,800, among the highest nationally, while Providence County has seen foreclosure filings increase 31% year over year through late 2025, showing housing stress building. Number 13 is Mississippi, where the combination of the nation's lowest median household income, at approximately $52,000, poverty rates exceeding 19%, and limited fiscal capacity creates a position where even modest recession becomes devastating for residents, while the state lacks resources to provide meaningful assistance. The state's pension funding ratio of roughly 61% means significant unfunded obligations remain, despite the state's small size, while outmigration of college-educated residents continues eroding what limited tax base exists. Here's what you need to understand about these 13 states as we move into 2026. The vulnerabilities we've examined aren't projections about what might happen during difficult economic times. These are current mathematical realities where existing debt obligations, pension underfunding, demographic decline, and revenue dependencies create positions where normal recession responses simply won't work. Illinois cannot raise taxes enough to cover its $144 billion pension hole without accelerating the departure that's already costing 122,000 residents. New Jersey cannot reduce its $9,490 average property tax burden without defaulting on obligations. California cannot retain high-income residents contributing 50% of income tax revenue when cost of living continues rising, while quality of life deteriorates. These states have reached positions where the 3 triggers we discussed, fiscal incapacity, employment concentration in vulnerable sectors, and demographic decline create cascading failure risk rather than manageable downturn. The metrics you should be monitoring as we move through early 2026 are specific and measurable. Watch state pension contribution requirements as a percentage of general fund spending. When this percentage exceeds 20%, the state has entered mathematical crisis territory, where maintaining services becomes impossible without federal intervention. Monitor net domestic migration patterns from IRS data, particularly the income differential between departing and arriving residents. When high-income residents depart at rates exceeding 40% above average while low-income populations grow, the fiscal death spiral has begun. Track foreclosure filing rates from ATOM and RealtyTrack, because housing distress appears in foreclosure data 6 to 9 months before it shows in broader economic statistics. Watch state bond spreads, the interest rate premium investors demand to hold state debt versus treasury bonds, because when spreads exceed 150 basis points, markets are pricing in real default risk. The reality heading into 2026 is that these 13 states have exhausted the tools that allowed them to survive previous recessions. They cannot cut spending further without collapsing essential services, because decades of deferred maintenance, infrastructure neglect, and pension underfunding have eliminated discretionary spending buffers. They cannot raise taxes meaningfully, because they already impose among the highest tax burdens nationally and face sustained outmigration of the productive residents who pay those taxes. They cannot borrow their way through crisis, because credit markets are already demanding premium interest rates that reflect recognition of unsustainable fiscal trajectories. November 2025 data shows foreclosure filings up 20% year-over-year nationally, housing inventory surging in key markets, and consumer confidence declining, all signals that recession conditions are building. When those conditions fully materialize, these 13 states face not just difficult budget years, but potential systemic failures requiring federal intervention. Which of these 13 states surprises you most with the severity of its vulnerabilities? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this analysis of state-level collapse risk heading into 2026 provided information you weren't getting elsewhere, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel for continued coverage of economic crisis conditions developing across America, and share this with anyone who needs to understand which states face the greatest danger. The data we've examined reveals that location matters enormously for economic security, and recognizing these vulnerabilities before crisis arrives provides the time to make informed decisions about where you live, work, and invest. The mathematics of state fiscal collapse are clear for anyone willing to examine the numbers without political bias. These 13 states have reached positions where recession triggers crisis rather than mere hardship, and understanding that reality now rather than after failures begin provides the advantage of preparation over panic. Let me show you something that should make every American pay attention right now. 13 states are sitting on the edge of economic collapse as we move deeper into 2026.